So good morning, everyone. My name is Christine Leonard. I'm the director of the DC office for the Vera Institute of Justice. It's great to see so many familiar faces here this morning, but for those of you that may be new to this series or less familiar with Vera, Vera is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that does a lot of research and policy work and technical assistance around criminal justice and immigration reform. The organization has been around for close to 52 years. We're based with our headquarters in New York, but also have an office here in DC as well as New Orleans and Los Angeles. We are incredibly fortunate to be able to wrap up this series of educational briefings that we've been holding with the support of the MacArthur Foundation around youth justice issues. I'm particularly excited about the presentation that we'll be having this morning around the intersection and the intricacies of interagency collaboration for youth that are caught up in both the justice system as well as child welfare. So we have another excellent panel for you to hear from this morning. But before we jump into that, I just wanted to make a few small observations about the current climate and where we're headed to and going ahead in this coming year. For all of you last night who may have had an opportunity to hear the president's speech, I think it's incredibly noteworthy to observe that in addition to many of the other important points that the president made, that this is the first time since 2004 that a president has noted the opportunities for criminal justice reform in a State of the Union speech. As some of you may recall, in 2004, President Bush made the observation that perhaps in our society that we should allow for individuals to get second chances, and talked about the need to provide supportive services for individuals who are coming back to our communities from prison. That moment was really a watershed point for the impetus behind the passage of the Second Chance Act legislation, which is now up for reauthorization. Last night, President Obama said, "Surely we can agree it's a good thing for the first time in 40 years, the crime rate and the incarceration rate have come down together, and use that as a starting point for Democrats and Republicans, community leaders, and law enforcement to reform Americans' criminal justice system so that it protects and serves us all." I really can't imagine a better way of articulating this incredible window of opportunity that we have as a country to take a hard look at our current practices and to think about ways that we can improve the criminal justice system. And as the president observed, we are doing so at a period where public safety in our communities remains an urgent and important priority. However, crime rates are going down. And so we can make the right choices without jeopardizing the safety of our families and our neighbors. To that end, it is an incredible privilege to recognize one of the new leaders around these issues in the Congress. We're really delighted and honored today to be joined by Congressman Joe Kennedy III. He represents the 4th District of Massachusetts. Prior to coming to Congress, Congressman Kennedy had his own direct experience working in the justice system as an assistant district attorney in 2 counties in Massachusetts. He also was a member of the Peace Corps, serving in the Dominican Republic, where he designed and implemented an economic development project that helped create jobs and increase the standard of living in an isolated community. Congressman Kennedy is a graduate of Harvard Law, where he was an active member of the school's Legal Aid Bureau, and also founded an after-school program for at-risk youth during the time that he was there. I also observe on a very personal note that I was very privileged to work for Senator Kennedy, and during my time with the senator, often in some quiet moments as we would be waiting for votes or there'd be a lull in the car on the way to an event, he would bring up his family and his incredible pride for what some of them were involved with and where they were at. And I distinctly recall one nephew's name coming up quite more often than others, and just with an incredible affection and respect and admiration. So we're just thrilled that the Congressman was able to join us this morning, and we'll turn it over to him for some opening remarks. Thank you.
It's amazing what happens when you can take dogs for a walk, right? Thank you all so much for being here, making the time for an important conversation this morning. I'm grateful to you on a number of levels, and I'll get into that in a second. Particularly one, is that our Energy and Commerce Committee hearing is just starting down the hall, so I appreciate a very good excuse to be fashionably late. On a little bit more serious note, though, to the panelists, a really extraordinary set of panelists from diverse backgrounds and from across the country, I want to thank you for participating and leading an important discussion about protecting our nation's most vulnerable youth, in particular those that have been impacted and are impacted and will be impacted by our criminal justice system. As someone who spent a couple years trying cases in Massachusetts court, I know how deeply critical your mission is in our communities across the country. Due in large part to the efforts of many of you and the organizations you represent, the juvenile arrest rate has steadily been declining over the past several years. But I don't have to tell you that your work, our work, is far from done. From drug treatment to child welfare to education and mental health, we must use an interagency approach to juvenile justice. Whether tackling high recidivism rates or ensuring our youth never face a criminal justice system in the first place, there's no one-size-fits-all approach. The Robert F. Kennedy National Resource Center for Juvenile Justice in Massachusetts uses a comprehensive approach to this challenge by focusing on youth with prior or current involvement in both the child welfare and juvenile justice systems, known as dual status youth. The discussion that you'll embark in and engage in today about cross-sector collaboration is critical to finding the necessary reforms that we need to drive our country forward. On a very, very personal note, I just want to say thank you. I want to say thank you, obviously, to the Vera Institute and a couple of my great uncle's alumni that are in the room today. As I said, coming in, I'm probably biased. I thought he was a pretty good senator. You don't have to be in this job very long to realize you are only as good as the people that you're surrounded by and with. And so for those of you who made an extraordinary commitment to him, to Massachusetts, and to our country, I'm grateful, as are the people of Massachusetts, for what you have done. To the RFK Children's Action Corps and National Resource Center, an organization close to my heart, founded after my grandfather passed away, and a national leader in these issues. It's a privilege for me to be able to join you briefly this morning. Thank you for all the work that you do. Most importantly, to, I think, all of you in this room, which is really exciting to see the different organizations, different entities that you represent from across the country, from different aspects of social justice, from different faith-based communities, law enforcement agencies, government policies, policy organizations, think tanks. The idea that now we are all gathered in the same room to try to see how each of us can tackle some challenge of this reform. It's exciting. It's going to generate the momentum I think we need. And so a pledge from me to all of you, our office is open to be a resource for you in any way. Chief of Staff is in the back of the room. We'll make sure you all get his phone number and email. So however we can be helpful to you in this conversation going forward, please don't hesitate to ask. Thank you very much for having me. Good luck today.
So again, thank you, Congressman. It's so exciting to think about the opportunities that we have ahead with some true leaders, as well as the passion and commitment that takes for things to get done. And to the staff that are here today, it's really each of you that has an opportunity to make a difference, not only for your constituents, but to really elevate the importance of these issues as national leaders on these topics. I just want to emphasize one key document that we've put out amidst the other piles of literature that you saw when you came in this morning. With the leadership of the MacArthur Foundation, the Vera Institute of Justice has been one of 4 core partners working around these issues from different perspectives. And this document, Advancing Juvenile Justice Recommendations in 3 Key Areas, highlights the top recommendations for action from each of the entities involved in this Resource Center partnership. As you'll hear from Jessica Heldman today from the RFK Children's Action Corps, many of their recommendations are contained herein, as well as those from Vera, and we've highlighted the work around status offenses in an earlier briefing. All of those prior briefings are available on our website, as well as the prior fact sheets, so we encourage you to take a look back if you weren't here to attend some of them in the past. And then just briefly, before I turn the panel discussion over to my colleague, Jim Parsons, the Vice President and Research Director for Vera, I would just add one quick comment for those of you that can look ahead on your calendars. It's really exciting that for our final concluding event around this series on February 6th at 9:30 in the Hart Building, up on the 9th floor. You have to take those elevators closer to Union Station to get up there. We'll have a lovely breakfast and a great view to help get your day started. But more importantly, we are very fortunate that Dr. Leonard Steinberg, who is the most preeminent researcher on adolescent brain development, has found time in his schedule to join us for a final keynote speech around this series of issues that we've been talking about throughout this series. Dr. Steinberg recently produced a book called The Age of Opportunity. He has just incredible insight into what's going on in the brain when you're a teenager. Something we all have in common. He's actually done path-breaking research around the risks that youth take whenever they're in that stage of adolescent development, which I think our panelists will also take note of in their comments today. And if for nothing else, a good incentive to come is that it may give you a chance to learn something about the brain science that you can then pick up the phone and call your parents and say, well, you know, I made some really dumb decisions, but I learned today that my frontal cortex was still developing. So I had no control over those reckless actions that I took. But the silver lining for all of us, and this really brings us back to the importance of the topic today at hand, is that whatever foolish choices or bad decisions we may have made during our youth, that there should be consequences, and those consequences should have proportionality with what the youth behavior was. But as our panelists will really delve into today, we have a justice system right now that perhaps does not really provide the opportunity for youth to make mistakes and get back on the right path, and that our systems need to work better together and more efficiently in order for kids to be able to recover from the mistakes that they make, or hopefully have the right guidance and support to help them get through these adolescent years. So with that, I'm very honored to have our colleague here, Jim from New York, who I'll turn it over to him to lead our robust discussion this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christine. Good morning, everyone. I'm very glad to be here. I feel honored to be able to participate in this discussion, and I'd like to thank the MacArthur Foundation for helping us make this possible. So I just have some very quick comments, and then I'll introduce our three panelists today. Then I have some questions that I'd like to run by them. So we're planning a kind of discussion kind of format. And then at the end, we'll open it to questions from the floor. And at that point, I believe that we will turn the cameras off and that we'll just be able to have a conversation which is between these four walls. So as Christine mentioned, I'm the research director at the Vera Institute of Justice. So much of my work involves thinking about how to use data, how to use information to coordinate services, to improve care for young people, and to reduce redundancy in the services that are provided. As we all know, increasingly, agencies across different sectors collect information. They collect mountains of information on a range of different facets of the work they do and the people they serve. However, the term silo has become almost ubiquitous to describe the way that agencies find it very difficult to share information beyond their borders in ways that, as I mentioned, can help coordinate services and ensure that young people don't fall between the fairly large cracks that can exist between agencies. Of course, this is particularly important for at-risk and vulnerable youth, where a missed opportunity to refer someone to treatment or a missed opportunity to keep someone in school by sharing information effectively can have disastrous consequences across the life course. So my work focuses on both adults and young people, but I'm really glad to be part of this discussion, thinking about how we can increase collaboration for young people who are at risk. Just quickly, I'd like to talk about some work that we did here in DC, because I think this demonstrates the value of information sharing. So in DC, a couple of years ago, we conducted a study where we took information on people who were arrested in the district, just under 3,000 people. We said to the police department, can you tell us who was arrested? And then we went to the mental health agency in the district, the jail, the probation agency, the pretrial services agency, and we said to those agencies, can you give us anonymized records for those people who were arrested? And we looked to see what mental health services people were receiving from across those agencies. And what we found is perhaps unsurprising, that each of the organizations had a different piece of the puzzle. So if you put together the information held across agencies to say, what's the best picture we can draw in terms of people's mental health needs, we found out that a third of the people who were arrested had a need for mental health treatment. However, those people were not known to all of the agencies. So people were routinely being missed if they were receiving services in the community, when they entered the jail, for example. Many of them were not identified as needing mental health services. And similarly, when people passed out the other end of the criminal justice system, they weren't being connected with services in the community. And as a result, we found that 40% of people who had a mental health need in the district were not known to community mental health care providers. So for 4 out of 10 people, their only way of getting mental health services was when they entered the criminal justice system and came into contact with probation or the police or pretrial services. And this is exactly the kind of problem that we want to try and address by using information sharing, by increasing the ability of agencies to share data. This is, in the area that I work in terms of public health, this is an essential moment, of course, to make sure that agencies are collaborating. With the Affordable Care Act, in states that are expanding Medicaid, now there is a whole new range of resources to serve people and young people who are at risk. And so we need to work effectively to make sure that we can share information, to make sure those who are eligible for benefits are identified and they're linked with services that they need. So just very quickly, before I move on to introduce the panelists, I'd like to talk about another project that we're doing at Vera. It's funded by the Department of Justice, and it thinks about the challenges of sharing information between health and justice systems. As part of this work, we've thought in some detail about what the barriers are, and we tend to think about these barriers in 4 areas, which might help, frame some of the comments. So firstly, we think of barriers in terms of cultural differences. So the fact that agencies, be it a justice agency or a Department of Education or a public health agency, often don't speak the same language. And so when it comes to thinking about how they share information on their shared clients, there's often barriers to how they talk about needs and sometimes trust issues around, I see it in my work in terms of drug treatment agencies not wanting to share information with the police, for example, because of what they think that information will be used for. There are legal considerations, HIPAA, FERPA, 42 CFR Part 2, that govern the release of different types of information, which are of course essential, but it's possible to navigate those issues to share information legally and safely. There are technical issues about how you go about sharing information, the information technology you need to communicate, which can be complex, but again can be overcome. And finally, there are ethical questions about if you're legally allowed to share information, if you're able to share it technically, does it make sense? Is it in the best interest of the young person to share information, and will it improve their access to care? So we have this resource, which is called Justice and Health Connect, which Vera developed. MacArthur has done groundbreaking work in this area as part of their Models for Change work. They've provided comprehensive guidance in the area of information sharing. And we're lucky enough today to have 3 panelists with deep expertise from different parts of the country who I'm sure will shine further light on this issue. Mike, can you just talk a little bit about the collaborative partnerships with other agencies and sectors that help you do your work?
Sure. Thanks, Jim. Good morning, everybody. So I'm from Connecticut. It makes it a little bit easier because there's a couple of unique things you should know about Connecticut. First of all, we don't have any county government at all. So we have no county jails, we have no county courts, we have no elected judges, we have no elected prosecutors, and so in terms of collaboration, we're dealing with a smaller pool of people. So I just wanted to say that in case you thought we had accomplished some good results, you'd say, well, it's a little bit easier to do that in Connecticut, I guess, so for starters. But for a long time, I've been involved in some of these national discussions through Vera, through the Council of State Governments, through the National Conference of State Legislators. And on the theme of collaboration and the value of it, especially on topics like juvenile justice reform, it came as a surprise to me that if you put a bunch of legislators and prosecutors and victim advocates and judges and defense attorneys and police officers in the same room, is it not working?
Yeah.
Oh. Is that better? There you go, okay. If you put everybody in the same room and ask them to talk about whatever the problem is, so let's say juvenile justice problems, it always impressed me that 80 or 90% of the discussion was based on consensus. In other words, people would all acknowledge similar problems. And whether there were Democrats or Republicans having this discussion, people tended to agree on the vast majority of things. And so in terms of the value of collaboration, although some people view it as kind of risky to bring a certain group into the room for fear that they might disagree with some of the things you're saying, it is always, and I'm talking about 30 years of experience now, it's always been the case that when it comes down to the frontline details of any type of criminal justice reform, perhaps most importantly juvenile justice reform, that the vast majority of practitioners will agree about the vast majority of things. So one real value you get out of collaboration is the realization that most people agree on most things. The other thing about collaboration, and perhaps this is one of the real obstacles in juvenile justice world, and this was more true maybe 10 or 15 years ago than it is today, but historically, people who work in the juvenile justice system were always protected by the issues Jim mentioned a moment ago, this perception of pure confidentiality for all these events. So whether it's in a school or in a courtroom or in a health provider office, there was always this sense that it was illegal to share information with others who might be trying to provide services to the same individual child. And overcoming that very real obstacle is a tremendous challenge, and the only way to do it is get people to talk to one another. And the final thing I want to say about that, because Jim has told us we have to be really concentrated on what we say here, is that I think half of the problem is not actual statutory prohibitions on information sharing. And in a way, all of those of you who work in the congressional policymaking process could perhaps help us with this, because there's a perception that this information sharing I'm describing is actually illegal when it's actually not unlawful, given who you're sharing the information with. And I think some people, in my experience, have used that as an excuse not to open the doors of whatever their operation is. I think people feel very comfortable doing their own thing, this silo thing that Jim was mentioning. But the moment others, outsiders, have the ability to see into what they're doing, to look at the data, to look at the outcomes, I think people get very nervous about that. And so this is a real obstacle, at least I've encountered, of people not really wanting to share information. So it's a valuable process, and I think it's indispensable in this area, the collaboration we're discussing.
Great, thanks, Mike. Jessica, perhaps just the same question for you. If you could talk a little bit about the kind of the collaborative partnerships that you see as being essential to do this work.
Well, in our role at the Resource Center, we provide resources, support to jurisdictions who are looking to collaborate, to create these multi-agency responses to what they see happening in their community. So we have the opportunity to go into states, go into local communities, and pose that question to them, to say, what is it that you can do better, or how can you do your work better through collaboration? We, of course, have our argument that it's a common sense proposition. Working together across agencies is an absolute necessity when you look at the population of youth we're talking about. In our center, we focus on dual status youth, and Congressman Kennedy talked about the definition of that. Just so that we're clear, these are the kids who have had contact with both the child welfare and the juvenile justice system, not to mention numerous other agencies. When we're talking about dual status youth, there is an incredible history. There are experiences, there are issues that they bring to the table when they have their contact with juvenile justice. So it makes sense that one agency alone is not going to be able to manage and handle the variety of issues that these youth and families bring to bear. So what we focus on with jurisdictions is taking a look at who are these youth in your community? And when we have the opportunity to bring together leaders, and we have the opportunity to look at data, and we have the opportunity to start talking across agency lines the same way youth and families have to cross agency lines, that's when we have the opportunity to actually do not only our job better, but to do our job baseline. Because when you have, as you do in King County, Washington, 2/3 of the kids who touch the juvenile justice system are going to have had some sort of historical contact with child welfare. Or if you have, as the juvenile justice data tells us, 65 to 70% of the kids coming into juvenile justice they meet the criteria for a diagnosable mental health disorder. That means they've been in contact with mental health or need to be. If you have kids, 80% of them, who have an educational disability or deficiencies, and you're trying to get those kids to maintain their education throughout their time in juvenile justice, you're trying to get them reintegrated, re-entering the education system, you need to partner with that group. In the AG's report on youth violence, children exposed to violence, we know that most of the youth have been exposed. They've experienced traumatic victimization. When we know that this is the characteristics of the youth that are coming into our juvenile justice system, again, we think it's a common sense proposition that you cannot handle those issues alone. Juvenile justice system thinks they can do it, they're sorely mistaken. If other agencies think they can do it, they are sorely mistaken.
Thank you, Jessica. And so you may see a pattern emerging here. Ryan, would you just to get us started, if you talk a little bit about how you've seen and experienced collaboration?
As Jim mentioned in my bio, the introduction, we lead a quarterly roundtable series at the Aspen Institute where we bring together over 30 federal agencies that have programs or services for Native youth. This is something that they have met occasionally when tragedies occur in Indian country and reservation communities to really kind of figure out what's going on, who's doing what. That happens so infrequently that we took it upon ourselves to create this series, and we've just had our 16th meeting on Friday with over 55 attendees. Over 30 of them were from federal agencies, from Justice, OJJ, DP, sent a contingent of folks to really just to get them to discuss, to talk about what each other is doing. They are all providing these programs and services for Native youth, but they are really not on the same page. In one of the first meetings that we had, we learned that there are multiple agencies working in the same community doing very similar things, and they weren't even aware of that. So just getting them on the same page was something, getting them in that room to discuss, and then we found that they wanted to keep coming back, that they found value in that, and that's something that we see that these federal agencies have a trust obligation to provide these services and programs for Native youth, and so we have to make sure from our standpoint that they're doing that in a way that is improving outcomes for Native youth, that are actually serving Native youth in a way that they need to be served. And so through those meetings, we bring together those folks. We also kind of hold their feet to the fire. We bring Native youth to those meetings to talk about their challenges that they're facing in the communities, the programs that they are experiencing that are coming from these federal agencies, to really get them to see what's happening in communities. And last time we had 15 Native youth, and they sat there right at the table next to these folks from Justice, HHS, Department of Ed, and we had folks from the White House as well, to really kind of focus and think about ways that they can increase coordination and collaboration among these agencies, things that they should already be doing already. We just kind of provide a safe space where we have closed door meetings that they are able to kind of talk through their challenges. And a lot of the challenges are coming, they themselves admit how siloed they are, how reluctant they are to share information. And we're really, this is kind of a first step. We're trying to break down those silos at a national level. On a more local level, we go out through CNAY's kind of model of outreach. We go out to communities, meet with young people to hear about their priorities. But we also bring together programs that are in tribal communities or in urban communities. We have them actually sit down, very similar to the DC model, the federal agency model. We bring together these federal agencies and other tribal programs that are in these communities to actually get them to get on the same page as well, think about their services, whether that's foster care or juvenile justice services or beyond that, to really get them to focus and work with one another. And one of the reasons I just really wanted to quickly say thank you to Vera for including CNAY in this, as we represent or advocate for the 2.1 million Native American youth in this country, a very oftentimes overlooked population, very, very invisible, but are, according to data from about 10 years ago, are arrested at 3 times the rate of the national population. They are overrepresented in foster care. So these are young people who are coming in contact with these systems at a very high rate. So this is a very important issue that pertains to them.
Thanks, Ryan. So I was wondering whether one of the panelists would like to talk about some of the benefits they've seen. So if there's, we've talked perhaps in more general terms about what the advantages are of collaboration. Does anyone have an example where people have successfully shared information to improve the safety net care that young people are able to access? So I don't want to put anyone particularly on the spot, but if anyone has an example from your work that you'd like to mention, I think it would be helpful.
Sure, I'd be happy to. We recently, excuse me, were involved in a demonstration project that had a county in Massachusetts that we worked in. And when we brought folks to the table and we talked about our dual status youth, and we talked about improving outcomes for these youth, we introduced some of the best practices around collaboration for that population. One of the things we talk about is case conferencing, coordinated case conferencing. So actually bringing together at the case-specific level the folks from probation and the Juvenile Justice Department and folks from child welfare so that they can literally physically sit at a table together and have some discussion about this youth and his or her case. So in Massachusetts, they adopted this practice, and there was one of the early cases was a young man who had been through every level of the child welfare system. He was arrested for assault and battery. While he was in detention, he was assaultive. He was sent to the hospital for a few days, stabilized, came back, continued his assaultive behavior in detention. So this kid was getting a direct ticket to the Department of Correction to be locked up. Because of the case conferencing practice, the juvenile justice and the child welfare system got together. They looked at this kid's history, and it was clear that his behaviors were not just behavioral. This child had a history of trauma. He had diagnosable mental health disorders, and what this child needed was treatment. So normally, the intensive treatment program that would have been a good fit for this youth would only be accessible if the child was in fact committed to the juvenile justice system. And that was what they wanted to avoid. So they were able to sit around a table and collectively come up with a creative and innovative approach, getting this kid evaluated outside of the juvenile justice system to allow him to take advantage of what the Department of Mental Health could offer him. He went to the intensive treatment program, he stabilized, he excelled, he came out of that program, was able to come back into the child welfare system at a lower level of residential treatment, and he continued to drop down levels of treatment till he was in independent living, and right now he's 19 years old. He is in school, in college, and employed, and truly the data shows us that those outcomes would have been far harder to come by if he had been committed to the Department of Youth Services. So that's just one example, one child who benefited from that kind of collaborative case conferencing that we encourage in jurisdictions.
So let me try with that was an individual example. Let me try with a systems change example of an outcome which we're particularly proud of in Connecticut. One thing we're not very proud of, or at least we didn't used to be, that in Connecticut it was one of only 3 states that treated all 16-year-olds as adults all the time. So if on your 16th birthday you were arrested for shoplifting, you'd go directly to adult court. That's just the way it was. It was Connecticut, North Carolina, and New York. So 10 years ago, the discussion began in Connecticut about shouldn't we raise the age of jurisdiction up to 18, where it is in most states. And the initial reaction to that was very hostile from pretty much everyone across the board, except for community advocates. But in terms of the institutional people, they're all very concerned about what that would entail in terms of spending and rethinking systems, et cetera. So the legislature enacted a process by statute. They said in 2 years we're going to raise the age of jurisdiction. We're going to do it incrementally. And before it starts to take effect, we want to make sure everybody who has a stake in this comes together and collaborates to figure out the best way to actually implement this. And just for example, when the process began, the estimates of cost and disruption were extraordinary. So a small state like Connecticut, they were talking about hundreds of millions of dollars to implement this change. Expanding juvenile courthouses, retrofitting police stations, everything you can imagine. It was sort of like a doomsday scenario. I think some people just assumed that if you just threw out these big budget price tags, it would never actually happen. But the legislature said, well, we're going to do it, and you people need to get together and really work through all of these details and come up with a true cost estimate. So fast forward to today, it's fully implemented. So, for example, the original estimate was, if you do this, the number of juvenile cases per year will go from 8,000 per year for the state to 18,000 per year. In reality, today, there's fewer than 8,000 cases coming in, even though all 16 and 17-year-olds have been added to the juvenile jurisdiction. It's also important to keep in mind that the number of kids in detention is way down compared to what it was before, even though 16 and 17-year-olds have been added to the mix. And I think this is happening because people really compared notes on what would happen, what was necessary, and more importantly, they looked further downstream and made some very important changes in what was taking place in school systems in terms of expulsions and suspensions. This is that school to prison pipeline people refer to a lot. So a lot of systems change emerge out of those discussions. And the final thing I want to say on that, and the thing I think we're most proud of here in Connecticut, and for those of you who have bosses who are concerned about data and outcomes, this is the one thing I would point to in Connecticut at least. So if all of this theoretical if all of this theoretical stuff is actually accurate, right? If people's aspirations really do come true, you'd be able to see it in the numbers. Not just what's going on in the juvenile system, what's going on in the adult system. So in general, crime is way down in Connecticut. That's a fact, and that's a fact in most states. But if you look at the number of people who are currently incarcerated in our Department of Corrections, and keep in mind that includes everybody that would normally be in county jails as well, all the pretrial population. The number in the 18 to 21-year-old cohort has declined by 48% in 6 years. So there's about half as many young people in our prison system today as there was 6 years ago. And all of the change, our prison population is down a lot, but all of that is concentrated among the youngest offenders. So that would be one indicator I would look at to see if all of this philosophical, theoretical stuff that people had hoped for and projected might happen 5, 10 years ago, if all of that was true, you would see this outcome we're realizing today. And you can imagine the amount of money that's been saved, and you can imagine the amount of crime that's been avoided by those kinds of changes. But all of that grew out of this mandated collaboration, which was very painful. I was involved in a lot of it. It was, I had to hear a lot of people, a lot of perspectives. But working through those problems got us to those outcomes we're experiencing today.
And I just wanted to highlight a few positive examples in the Indian country. With the support of RFK, some tribes in Minnesota are working toward integrating their services and improving information sharing. Some of those tribes are Red Lake, White Earth, and Leech Lake. And so what they're doing there is really, and they admit that it has been a struggle over the last 18 months or so as they're implementing this, that getting probation officers to work with social workers who, traditionally are, not adversarial, but they just don't work with one another, and getting them to actually coordinate and have meetings where a parent and a child are meeting with both those folks at the same time, really involving youth and their parents throughout this process, giving them a voice, which we talked about a few meetings past involving families is very huge in Indian country and within tribal communities. And so that's something where they're finding a lot of success. They're building on that and then incorporating traditional practices and other cultural appropriate services to better serve Native youth. And so they're finding a lot of success there. They're working to assess that those efforts, but they're making these first steps to really kind of break down some of those silos and really improve that system for Native youth.
Great. So, Mike, you already mentioned the issue of privacy and confidentiality and the extent to which that may sometimes be misunderstood or sometimes present more of an obstacle than it actually does in reality. My next question is about challenges. I wonder if you could talk perhaps about challenges generally, but also how you overcome this perception of federal privacy regulations being an insurmountable kind of challenge.
I think the strategy was the same in every case on how you get over this kind of thing. But one thing we found is that it's very important that when people throw out this hurdle to immediately challenge them on it. And through Vera and the Council of State Governments and others, we're able to hook the skeptics directly up with the experts in the federal bureaucracy who can actually answer the question, is it okay for us to share this information under these circumstances? And the ability to be able to say to people, I think you're wrong, but don't take my word for it. You can get a definitive and authoritative answer immediately by contacting in a particular, so it could be HIPAA, it could be FERPA, it could be whatever, but there are people who can actually answer those questions. And since you guys are helping make federal policy, the more obvious that is, the easier it is to make those contacts, the easier it would be for people like me and all of us to get people to collaborate, because that's a real obstacle. And as I said earlier, sometimes it's thrown out there not because they really are concerned about it, but it's a convenient excuse, and most people would say, okay, well, I guess you can't do it. And I can't tell you the number of times that journalists have called up about this or that proposal and saying, well, this is illegal under federal law. And I've had to say, actually, no, it's not, and here's how you can verify that instantly. But if you can make that easier, if you can highlight that obligation for all the relevant folks in the federal bureaucracy, that would be really important for me.
Right. Yeah. I mean, in my experience of this issue is that agencies where there's not a clear understanding of what the regulations allow, general counsels tend to default to a conservative position. So if it's we don't quite know what we can share, the response tends to be, we can't share,
Especially,
obviously, lawyers in these agencies are conservative, because they protect the interests of the agencies. But that's a difficult hurdle to overcome.
And especially when the senior management don't want to share that information in the first place, right? So that's a great excuse. They say, well, we don't want to be sued, and end of discussion. And there are ways around it, but it does. They're not going to take my word for it. They may not take your word for it or our word for it, but there are authoritative people who can get a quick answer. And usually there's a document that, there's already an advisory opinion that's been issued on half this stuff. And I'll give you one quick example. We were trying to get some data from the medical examiner's office related to, we had a very tragic incident in Connecticut a couple of years ago, and it all involved children who were shot to death. But there were some important questions that needed to be answered, and a lot of people threw up HIPAA as an excuse to not provide. I mean, it was going to be anonymous, but it was just going to be some basic data about what happened. And it was very interesting to tell people, so, HIPAA only applies to people who are actually alive, right? And this is not medical care provided to living persons. So nothing that goes on in a medical examiner's office is protected by HIPAA. That was an eye-opener to a lot of people, including everybody at the medical examiner's office. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about.
Yep. Jessica?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to echo what you're saying, that the default tends to be to close the door on sharing because of the fear and the threat of being sued. In reality, it just doesn't happen very often. When you talk about FERPA, there's an incredible fear of legal action, and it doesn't occur. Not to say that that means to not follow the law. It just means that sense that at any moment you could, be slapped with a lawsuit over sharing information just isn't the reality. So the reality instead is education. The reality is, first of all, understanding why non-disclosure is the baseline and why it's important. Because there are real concerns about privacy. There are concerns about how information is used. There are concerns about self-incrimination, bias. These are very, very real concerns. But those are conversations that can happen amongst a collaborative group that's going to talk about how folks use information in their community. So you have to start by understanding the reality of the laws. We have resources to that effect. We have the Models for Change Information Sharing Toolkit. This has been out for a few years, and we have an announcement out on the table that as of tomorrow, this has moved into a second edition online, and it has interactive opportunities to kind of put yourself in the shoes of someone having to make information sharing decisions for dual status youth, youth involved in juvenile justice and education, and you really walk through those scenarios, and all the answers are based on the federal law. So I invite you to check that out. But truly, this again is another opportunity for folks to come together and talk about what are the assumptions we have about the laws and what are the realistic concerns that we have about how information is going to be used. When we can voice those in a collaborative process, then we can start addressing what do we need to better understand and what do we need to train on. We have judges that we have worked with in communities where when they find out that a youth has been involved in foster care, their instinct is to be more paternalistic and more protective and potentially bring them into the system when they wouldn't otherwise be in the system. That's a concern that can be addressed through training, through education, and really underlies the importance of understanding the iatrogenic effect of juvenile justice, why we want to steer kids out of it. So it's sometimes an entree into some of the more important conversations we can have.
Great, thank you.
Just really quickly echoing the remarks from my panelists. In a specific example in North Dakota, working with a tribal community there, this was more focused on child welfare, but we had a lot of folks on the call. They're from the state, the tribe, the federal agencies, and majority of those folks had no idea really what they could and couldn't share. So there's a lot of reluctance, taking those conservative positions. And we were trying to, direct them to the resources or the information that they needed to really kind of assuage those fears. And that was a conversation. We had multiple conversations about that, and it was just something that was really, really frustrating because in this situation there were actually literally children dying in this community as a result of some of these issues. And we couldn't get past some of these, their reluctance to share information. And so, this is, I'm afraid of what's happening in other communities. We are on the call with these folks, but this could be happening in communities throughout Indian country, throughout the United States. And so that's a real fear, and really being able to point them to these useful resources and probably having multiple conversations about this to really, alleviate some of those fears and provide them with some clear direction on this would be really, really important and useful.
And I want to emphasize one thing so you don't get the wrong impression. We are talking about information that is actually confidential. We're not talking about releasing it publicly. We're talking about people, all of whom have the obligation to keep it confidential, sharing it amongst themselves. So we're not talking about an exception to the confidentiality rule. We're talking about the ability to collaborate and share information, knowing that so if you're a police officer getting some school information, you can have it to do your job, but you're still under the same obligation to keep it confidential. So just to be clear about that.
I think that's an excellent point. And also, just to emphasize that people often think when you talk about information sharing between agencies, that means that everything that's known by that agency about a young person will be an open record. And that's clearly not the case. Information sharing should always be structured based on a kind of what you need to know to provide care to that young person. So it may be one piece of information that's transferred from one agency to another, rather than just this kind of carte blanche kind of information sharing, which I think is often sometimes misunderstood. Anything else just on this issue of challenges and ways that you've kind of navigated those challenges? So, when it's come to think about how agencies can collaborate more effectively, what's kind of come up, if anything, and how have you kind of responded to those beyond the kind of legal considerations?
Well, I would say beyond the legal considerations or following from them, there are issues in terms of just the technicalities, the technology of sharing information is an incredible challenge in a lot of communities. Data systems are set up to respond to what information needs to be submitted for compliance and in response to mandates. And these are, in these systems that we've now talked about several times being so siloed and isolated from one another, they're working under different mandates. So they're reporting different kinds of information, and they develop their own systems. And these systems do not talk to each other. So even when you have the opportunity to break through some of the cultural issues, some of the fear issues, some of the distrust, there still is a significant challenge that comes into play because technologically speaking, it is incredibly difficult in some communities to find a way for these systems to talk to one another. Between child welfare and juvenile justice, mental health, and education, this continues to be a problem. It takes a lot of resources. It takes a lot of resources to restructure the way that you house or share your information. And that, of course, is always in short supply in the communities that we work with in these public systems.
You know, and if I could dovetail with that a little bit, so in Connecticut, as a result of a different tragedy, you may have seen something, there was a, you know, we call it the Cheshire murders in Connecticut. This doctor's family was murdered by these two guys that just got out of prison. It was a really nightmare. And in that particular case, the two guys, one in particular who did it, had just gotten out on parole. And in one guy's case, if the Department of Corrections and the parole board had been aware of the story with this one guy, this Komisarevsky guy, they probably would have treated the case very differently, even though all this information was known at the time he was arrested and prosecuted and sentenced. None of this ever got communicated. And so as a result, the solution was, and the legislature enacted this in 2008, was a mandate to create a comprehensive information sharing system that everybody who is either directly or indirectly involved in the criminal justice process could share information based on their having the appropriate credentials to see whatever particular piece of information. So we've been trying to build this thing for 6 years now in Connecticut, and it's very, very challenging. But the end result, which I'm optimistic we'll get to in a year or two, but I'm just emphasizing it takes a long time to work through all these kinds of problems, and this would apply to the juvenile information as well. The end result, and you know, I'm kind of old. Most of you look like you're techno savvy, right? You know, so the end result is going to be, and if you can imagine this for a second, anybody in the criminal justice system would be able to essentially do a Google type search for a name, for an address, for a situation, for a profile, whatever it happens to be, and this tool would retrieve all the information that's available within the entire criminal justice world, and that covers a lot of ground, not just cops and prisons, but you know, motor vehicles and everything else, and organize it just like you'd imagine if you, depending on the search phrase or word you enter into a Google search, it would bring this information back to you. And we're going to be linking like 128 different data systems, connections to do this. And so if we can do it, it'll be extraordinary. So I'm just saying it may come to fruition in Connecticut in a year or two, but all I'm trying to emphasize now is the process to go through to get this to happen is really painful. And one thing in particular has a federal dimension. And for those of you who are looking for ideas, you know, I work for Governor Malloy in Connecticut, so I'm not speaking on his behalf. I should put that disclaimer out there right now. It's just my experience in this process, is that the FBI have a very, very restrictive rule governing access to what they refer to as FBI information. And to make a long story short, any information that is sent to the FBI as part of an arrest, et cetera, is cataloged, basically. And when a new person's arrested, they check their ID, and the FBI will tell you what their criminal history is. But when they're sending back information, even if 100% of it came from the state, when it goes back, it's FBI information, subject to this enormous overlay of restrictions on who can have access to it and under what circumstances. And that is perhaps the biggest single problem in merging these systems. Even though we own all this data, some of it technically is FBI data, and we've been working with them. They've been pretty good about trying to be flexible on how to do this, but maybe someone should take a look at rethinking this system in light of all the advances that have taken place in information sharing, because it can really put a damper on anybody's goal to have a comprehensive information sharing system. And, you know, I can give you case after case in Connecticut where this would have made a huge difference. Had a police officer who was on his way to a scene of a reported incident could have found out, in one case, that the guy inside there had a couple of restraining orders against him and had a bunch of guns. And as the police officer went into the basement, not knowing what he was getting into, the guy who was a retired correction officer opened up on him with a fully automatic assault weapon and killed him. So had he known any of those details, all of which were available but in different databases, they would have handled it. You know, so that's one of a million examples. But this challenge is definitely something for the future, because I think it's people have a right to expect that we would run our public safety agencies in the same way that international banks run their business. I can be in Hungary and withdraw money from an ATM like that, right? But if we want to get access to information in Connecticut, you have to ask for someone to pull a file and photocopy it and mail it to you, that kind of thing. And it's just not acceptable in this day and age. So.
I just want to touch on a few things that are really specific challenges for Indian country. Jessica had mentioned a lack of technology. In some communities, there's no internet. Some of these agencies don't even have sufficient number of computers. We were trying to track down funding for computers so they're able to even operate these types of systems. Staffing is a huge issue. In some communities, they can't hire or they can't find people to be social workers or probation officers. And that creates a huge challenge with caseloads and things like that. Beyond that, just the resources, the funding for their social services and juvenile justice programs, their public safety, those are severely underfunded. And then just on top of all of that, with tribal communities that are interacting or engaging with non-native communities or entities, there's a historical mistrust of those local agencies, or those local governments, those state governments. So there's a reluctance on that part. So that creates a huge challenge, not wanting to work together. When they do, come together for a purpose to work toward a common goal, then there comes in the difficulties with the lack of coordination, the lack of information sharing. So even when they get to that point, they're still hamstrung in a lot of ways. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So something which I think all of you have touched on at some point during your comments is this issue about building partnerships, about who you bring to the table, and observations that when you do, as you mentioned, Mike, that people often agree on more than they disagree on. And Ryan, you gave examples of the Interagency Council where you bring people together. My perception is that once people want to share information, then you're at least 50% of the way there. That getting people to realize that they have oftentimes the same objectives, even if they're working in different systems, is a big part of the problem, or can be a big obstacle. I just wonder if you have how you've gone about doing that, who you need at the table, who the key stakeholders tend to be. Is it the heads of agencies, is it more operational, and how you kind of start those conversations to move these initiatives along.
Well, in Connecticut, again, I explained the process to get the what we call the Raise the Age initiative passed. Now that it's fully implemented, one of the key and by the way, in Connecticut, we don't have term limits either, so we tend to have legislators who stay for a long time, which I would argue is I was there for 24 years, for example, but the key legislator in this particular case is the co-chair of the Appropriations Committee, and she has taken a strong interest and she, by statute, created this follow-on from the Raise the Age initiative. Now there's a permanent Juvenile Justice Policy Advisory Committee that she is the co-chair of, and the other co-chair is my boss in the governor's budget office, Ben Barnes. And the two of them, every month, have to sit in a meeting with all of the characters around the table to talk through all of the issues as they unfold in the juvenile justice system. So I think this, in our case, mandated collaboration. People really don't want to do it, but when they get there, it's a painful process, but I think the results speak for themselves. So I actually think, you need everybody. You do need the high-level people, because if you get the subordinates or the actual doers there, they'll say, well, I agree, but I don't have any authority to commit to anything. So you really need the top people there, and if they're making my boss sit through it, he's learning a lot, and at the same time, other people take their cues from him because he's in charge of the budget and she's in charge of the legislative version of the budget. And so, as they say, money talks. And
So when we talk about who comes to the table, the question we have to ask is, what are they doing at the table? And the idea, as Mike talked about, that underlying all of this work are some shared values and some shared goals. It's true. Articulating those values and articulating those goals is kind of another story. So you need to have the high-level folks with authority who can make decisions and who can articulate what the values and what the policies are driving these new ideas around information sharing. That has to be at the core of it. So you have to commit the time to articulating those goals, and that takes those upper-level folks. At the same time, you need to have the input, not to mention the buy-in, of folks who are doing this information sharing work day in and day out on the ground. So whether it's some line staff representatives or supervisors from child welfare, from juvenile justice, at the table telling you how it really is on the ground, that's how you can get the insight you need to make truly the kinds of changes that need to occur. And as Ryan talked about, having youth and families represented at the table is essential. It's their information. We use terms like information and we use terms like data. These are the stories of people's lives. This is what they have been going through and what they're struggling with, and what sometimes is, embarrassing and difficult to have shared in front of a courtroom, in front of a group at a case conferencing practice. So it's very important to have their perspective on how this can be done sensitively so that they're building trust with the systems when you're sharing information. You can sit all day and share information, and if the children and the families don't want to have anything to do with the professionals at the table and the case plans, you're not going to succeed. And then the last thing I'd say is, nobody wants us there, but you have to have the lawyers at the table. You absolutely have to. You have public defenders who have an extremely important job in protecting the rights of youth and making sure that they do not incriminate themselves. And this is an incredibly important position that requires zealous advocacy. Honestly, it can be a huge barrier in getting information sharing structures in place, but it's a barrier that needs to be faced from the outset, that needs to be respected. This is our perspective. You need to respect what that public defender is bringing to the table and have that discussion early on so that you're not spending a year, which is what these information sharing initiatives can take. So you're not spending a year talking about sharing information and then have somebody come in and put the kibosh on it, and all is lost. That really makes for a difficult situation. So that's who we find is important to have at the table.
And just jump in there. I mean, also we found that the people who really understand the data are important to have there as well. So, again, it can be, you can have a high-level discussion about the need to share information and we want to communicate. But if you don't have the people involved who say, well, we don't record information in that way, or something as simple as we can't match that, we don't know who is in your system, we can't match them with our system. That's also just a different facet as well, I think, which is important. Ryan.
Jim, you touched on a really great point, but in a challenge within the roundtable series that we host at CNAY, where we invite the heads of agencies, and we do have folks, the acting director from Indian Health Service, from Bureau of Indian Affairs, Bureau of Indian Education, get these folks there. But we also try to focus, we want them to be high enough where they have some influence, they can make decisions, but they also understand what's happening on a more operational, on a programming level. But we do, when we start these conversations, we go to the heads of these agencies to really get their buy-in. Because they're not going to, if they're not the right, if they wanted to send someone who understands the data a little bit better, we actually have to get their buy-in and have them do that. And that takes a lot of relationship building and lots of conversations, building that trust. And so when we have these meetings, if we have one on education and they're a part of it, we can go to them on an issue of juvenile justice or foster care and talk to them because we've already got that trust. And so we're building that up over time. And like Jessica mentioned, we do bring youth to our meetings and have them very much a part, front and center. Either they're presenting to kind of set the tone for the meeting, or they're actively involved throughout. the roundtable discussion. And so those are a few things, but we do run into that challenge of if they're too high, they're not going to really kind of understand what's going on necessarily in lower level. But if they're too low, they don't have any impact or influence in the agency. And so it's kind of a dance.
Thank you. So, considering where we are today, my last question before opening it up to the floor is, what are some ways that the federal government can demonstrate leadership in this area? And we've touched on a few of them, but just to all of you, whoever wants to jump in first, how can they be involved?
Well, aside from the suggestions I made about clarifying what is and what is not confidential and under what circumstances, et cetera, I think one thing that was really valuable to us was technical assistance, right? Bringing in experts from around the country to help inform our decisions. So it wasn't really paying for a new project. It was just helping us get some perspective on what we were doing. And, in our case, just shaming the rest of the state into the fact that, we're the only state that pretty much that treats 16-year-olds as adults. But having people come in and articulate that, including, it's a very blue state, obviously, I think. And I should emphasize, by the way, that reform process I was discussing happened first under a Republican governor, then under a Democratic governor. So this was a very bipartisan, and all the votes were virtually unanimous. But skeptics who are, let's just say, more conservative, tough on crime-ish, needed to hear, especially like police chiefs, needed to hear from folks from other jurisdictions about the concerns they had. We bring in a police chief from Texas or wherever and say, well, hey, we had a guy who took over he became chief of the New Haven, Connecticut Police Department. He had been chief of the Green Bay, Wisconsin Police Department previously, where they do treat 17-year-olds as juveniles. And he came in and when we met with him, he says, I can't believe we have to deal with 16-year-olds as adults. That's crazy. And we said, would you please go to the Capitol and tell everybody that? Because, here's a law enforcement guy from another state who was just explaining, like, this is nuts. And the ability to bring in people with those kinds of perspectives is very valuable, and OJJDP has been very helpful with that.
I just want to second that. I think that that's what we find in collaborative initiatives, information sharing initiatives, is that having somebody from the outside to come in is important. I also think that the level of technical assistance is also very important. We've been pleased to be supported by OJJDP in demonstration projects. We're launching one just next month, actually, in 4 sites, including Alaska, Indiana, Georgia, and California. And when we engage a community in these demonstration projects, we are there on the ground. We call it intensive technical assistance. And we are able to help with that relationship building that Ryan talked about. We're able to be at the table with all these folks physically and begin to talk about some of these issues and bring from the field what has worked, and then take those lessons to share with the field afterwards. So the support of the demonstration projects is really essential. I think another way that the federal government can be of support in this area is continuing to articulate the science that Christine talked about at the beginning, this developmental approach when we're talking about juvenile justice reform. If we are trying to find common ground amongst agencies that have worked in isolation from one another, that have different orientations, that to this day, folks coming into child welfare as social workers, folks coming into juvenile justice departments as line level probation officers, these folks are being trained very, very differently with some very different language and some different orientations. And the training, once they are at work, still continue to sometimes be based on really outdated assumptions. So the continued messaging, and we see it in the reauthorization language for JJDPA, that really policies need to be based on what we know about youth and what the science has shown and proven to us. That's going to be able to continue to create a foundation upon which collaborative efforts can be built.
And to echo both of the comments from Mike and Jessica, especially the clarifying information sharing, letting folks know on the ground, what they can and can't do, would clear up a lot of uncertainty. And also just a lot of, really pushing for collaboration. I know Senator Heitkamp has introduced a bill, Commission on Native Children, to assess outcomes for Native youth, but really has an emphasis on collaboration and coordination among federal agencies. Having that kind of that push to really force that is something that's really necessary. Otherwise, we're going to continue to have very siloed federal agencies who are going to be doing, the same things in the same communities, not on the same page, and really just wasting resources. And so that's something I think, really encouraging that, pushing that, the messaging aspect that Jessica mentioned, talking about, the science and the models that are out there, really holding up these successful models that are in place, that are occurring not just in Indian country, but throughout the United States, where they're having success and where they're, demonstrating why this is important and how it's working, and really kind of, emphasizing those and really pushing for those. It's going to be really important from a federal level to really kind of have that top-down kind of approach. So.
Thank you very much.